The Civil Rights Act of 1871. This legislation set up a system of federal supervision of elections. One thing for Congress to say to the states, you can't discriminate when it comes to voting, you can't discriminate on the basis of race. It's another thing to have some means by which to oversee the administration of elections, and that's what this legislation does. It sets up that system of federal supervision of elections. The Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 was intended to protect black citizens against intimidation by illegal action, racial terrorism, as we might call it, by organizations such as the KKK, in states where the state government either would not or could not intervene on behalf of African American citizens. In other words, Congress is saying, if the states aren't going to protect their African American citizens, then the federal government's going to do it. All right, and the last one on my list is really the key one for our purposes. Civil Rights Act of 1875, entitled All Persons to Full and Equal Enjoyment of Public Accommodations. What do we mean by public accommodations? We mean privately owned and operated enterprises that are open to the public. In this country, then and now, we don't have government-owned hotels. Right? They're privately owned and operated. We don't have government-owned restaurants that I know of. Right? We don't have government-owned amusement parks or theaters. Right? These are all private enterprises. And what Congress is saying in this legislation is that the people who own and operate these enterprises that are open to the public cannot deny admission or cannot deny service on the basis of race. You do that, you're subject to the penalties of federal law. I also noted there that this was the last piece of civil rights legislation that was passed by the United States Congress for another 80 years, until 1957. And I'll tell you here in just a bit why that was the last Civil Rights Act passed by Congress for 80 years. Okay? But it's a very significant piece of legislation. Okay? And as I said, it's the one that we're going to focus on here. Because as you might guess, the constitutionality, the constitutional validity of that legislation was challenged fairly quickly. And a case comes before the Supreme Court in 1883, or several cases come before the Supreme Court in 1883 under the heading of the civil rights cases. Okay? So we're going to look at those here in just a second, but the bottom line is that the Supreme Court declares that Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional. So I said a moment ago that this is the last piece of civil rights legislation passed by Congress for 80 years. Why is that? Well, there's probably two main explanations for that. One reason that it's the last civil rights legislation passed by Congress for 80 years is because the Supreme Court kind of puts a nail in the coffin of the first civil rights movement. But what I call the first civil rights movement, I don't know that any textbook anywhere refers to this period as the first civil rights movement. The reason I call it the first civil rights movement is because, if we were to take a survey and go out and ask, 1,000 randomly selected Americans, when was the black civil rights movement? What do you think they would probably say? Most Americans would probably say the middle part of the 20th century. Few Americans today seem to be aware that almost 100 years earlier there was a first black civil rights movement. It's all this legislation that was passed by Congress during the Reconstruction period. What I call the first black civil rights movement, the Reconstruction era civil rights movement. Why did that come to an end? Well, one answer to that question, why did that come to an end, is because the Supreme Court basically took the wind out of the sails as a constitutional matter. That Congress can't pass that legislation. Again, we'll talk about the logic of that, or the reasoning of that here in just a second. But the other reason that that comes to an end is, quite simply, the politics changes. Remember the numbers I showed to you a moment ago about, the Republican majorities in Congress? Right? Look what happens. Okay, so the 43rd Congress is 1873 to 1875, and you've got significant Republican majorities, over 2/3 in the House and almost 3/4 Republican majorities in the Senate. In the 44th Congress, which began in 1875, we're back to divided government, okay? Where the Republicans control the Senate. Control is a strong word. Where the Republicans have a majority in the Senate and the Democrats have a majority in the House of Representatives. I mean, we think divided government is a phenomenon of the early 21st century. It's not. Americans have been divided on important issues for a long, long, long time. So the political will just sort of evaporates. The Republicans don't have these huge majorities anymore. They have to contend with Democratic majorities in the other chamber. And so no new civil rights legislation gets passed. Okay? So that is, that's the second piece. And by the way, many African American leaders, including Booker T. Washington, some of you may recognize that name, also began to openly accept or acquiesce to, at least, Jim Crow laws.